Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be a part of this really important conversation that our community is very aware of and something that I'm so glad to see you here engaged in. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Nicole Fearman. She's a part of our organization. She is the mental wellness supervisor. This is a new position that we've invested in as a school district based on the feedback from our community. So we have a whole division that she's going to talk a little bit about that's dedicated to mental wellness now here at Mason City Schools. And I am so excited to talk about that because it's not something that you see everywhere. So here's Nicole. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. First of all, I want to say I'm so grateful to be working in a district and working with a community that's wrapping their arms around this mental health crisis. And really has risen to the occasion to allow us to develop a department, a team of individuals who can help us create innovative programming to help our students here in Mason. So as part of that, we've developed a team of individuals, mental wellness coordinators that are going to be on each campus this year. So if I could, I'm going to introduce them. They will stand up. Laura Martin is our wellness coordinator, K-2. Brianna Lynch, wellness coordinator, 3-6. Michelle Dorsey, wellness coordinator, 7-12. Molly Schmidt is our district resource coordinator. And then we have Becca Flynn and Jenny McNeese, both Children's Hospital clinical therapists. In addition to that, we have 4 other clinical therapists serving 7-12 through Children's Hospital, and 4 therapists that will hopefully be in place soon with solutions therapy for K-6. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and introduce tonight's speakers. We have Dr. Sorter, the Director of Psychiatry from Cincinnati Children's Hospital, who will be speaking first, and then Dr. Slavin, who is a Senior Scholar for Wellbeing.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. It's a nice opportunity to talk to the people at schools, and I would I think reiterate the issue about really how advanced Mason has been, and really promoting health in young people and trying to not only address people perhaps that have problems, but actually be preemptive and hopefully prevent them from developing. And I think tonight's just another example of that. So my hat's off to the district and the people that run it, and it's really a great opportunity to be here. So I am going to talk a little bit. My job is to kind of give you a little bit of an introduction. And if I'm not too challenged by this, am I going the wrong direction? Here we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about brain and mental health. Actually, I give this talk to a variety of people, change it around a little bit, from anywhere from about 5th or 6th grade all the way up to adults. So one of the things I always like to start off with is, just trying to normalize this a little bit. So I have an arts and science background, so we'll start with the arts and sciences. So what do these people have in common? You have Charles Dickens in the upper left-hand corner, who, of course, wrote anything from The Christmas Carol to Oliver Twist. One of the great authors of all time, had horrific problems with mood disorders, tortured by them many times. But here he was, really a pioneer to really advocate for the downtrodden through his books. Really remarkable. The next picture over is the Pietà in Rome, Michelangelo. What a grand slam, the Pietà, Michelangelo's David, and the Sistine Chapel. Probably the most amazing artist that we know. Appears to have had a really terrific bipolar disorder. Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, bouts of depression off and on throughout his life, struggling throughout. Of course, Ernest Hemingway, who you probably recognize, one of our great authors, also troubled by depression and substance use. The bottom picture on the right is actually the memorial in Westminster Abbey to Isaac Newton. Of course, the discoverer of gravity. Probably also had bipolar disorder from what they can tell from many of his writings. So again, many of the people in sciences also with significant mental health problems. Let's talk about music and war, an interesting combination. Beethoven, significant bouts of depression. I forgot to advance. The next picture is you have Lincoln, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant. Probably the three people responsible for us still being one nation. You had Sherman with bipolar disorder, Abraham Lincoln with severe bouts of depression even before the war, and Ulysses S. Grant, who battled with substance use disorder throughout his whole life. But again, all these people making fantastic contribution. And then just one more. Whoops. Sometimes you get caught up between how many machines you're operating at one time. Whoops. More modern figures, of course. Winston Churchill, again, cyclical mood disorder throughout, some substance use problems. We have Leonardo DiCaprio with obsessive compulsive disorder. Also, Daniel Radcliffe has struggled with some also similar anxiety issues. And then Lady Gaga also has been very public about her battles with trauma. And so here we have people that have had a variety of mental health problems, be very successful, make great contributions to our society. So I want to kind of go through a few myths now. And let me just see if I can get this straightened out here so we can not have as many problems. So myths. Mental health problems don't affect me. Children don't experience mental health problems. There are people with mental health problems are violent or unpredictable. If they really tried really hard, they could snap out of it. And there's really no hope for people with mental health problems. And I can't do anything for someone who has mental health problems. So let's kind of go through a few of these and some other ones and kind of see if we can maybe get some more accurate information. Mental health problems don't affect me. Well, 1 in 5 American adults experience a mental health issue. 1 in 10 young people experience a period of major depression as they grow up. 1 in 25 Americans live with a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. Probably that rate's a little bit low. When you start looking at disability in children, 1 out of 10 children is disabled because of a mental health problem. And so these things are pervasive or throughout our society, but they are treatable. And then, of course, suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the United States, 10th, going up, but it's the second when we look at people from the ages of 10 to 35 years old. Second only to accidents. So it's really becoming a very prominent, consistent problem. Okay, children don't experience mental health problems. Even young children may have early warning signs of mental health concerns. They're often diagnosable and there's oftentimes a product of interaction of biological, psychological, and social factors. Half of all mental health disorders start before the age of 14. The big problem is only about less than 20%. We're doing a little bit better, really receive the treatment they need. The majority get 0 treatment. So we're really talking about a deficit of recognition and getting people enrolled in the appropriate treatment. This is why I actually am very excited about what Cincinnati is doing in a school like Mason. And that is really throughout our region here, we have begun putting in place mental health programs in the schools. And I'm not sure if Susan Shelton is here through Mindpeace. She's in the back there. She's been a major, really the catalyst for much of this work. So that now, what we find is kids who are getting referred in the schools, about 80% at least get plugged into treatment, as compared to community care, where we're often talking less than 50. So these are really important steps that as a community and by participation by schools like this, that we're really trying to up the game here and do a better job. The next myth is people with mental health problems are violent and unpredictable. This is so prominent in our daily discussions now with all the horrific problems with gun violence. The facts are very different. That really, the vast majority of people with mental health problems are no more likely to be violent than anyone else. Most people with mental illness are not violent, and only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to individuals living with serious mental illness. People with mental illness, severe mental illness, are really much more likely to be victims because they're seen as easy prey by others. I think sometimes is what we see as people that engage in abnormal behavior, we want to lump them into some easy category, and we call it mental illness, and then we say, well, the treatment's not good enough, but we really aren't necessarily doing the things we need to really make things safer, and becomes a political football. The next one is personality weakness or character flaws cause mental health problems. People with mental health problems could really snap out of it if they want to. It really has nothing to do with being lazy or weak. As we saw earlier, some of the most ambitious and productive people in society have struggled with mental health problems. But they really come down to a multitude of factors. Much of it biologic, what your genetics are, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. What your life experiences are, such as trauma or history of abuse. And then, of course, what your family, what mental health problems that might exist there. But people with these severe problems, even though they're not personality or weakness or minor issues, they can get better with treatment. Okay, the myth. There's no hope for people with mental health problems. Once a friend or a family member develops a mental health issue, he or she will never recover. The exact opposite is true, especially in young people. Young people, the resiliency we see is tremendous. And so kids who have depression, anxiety, even young people that have experienced trauma or have other type of problems, even psychosis, most of them get significantly better. We may not be able to cure them, but we can oftentimes get them back on a trajectory of normal development. A lot of times it takes time, it takes a lot of work, but it's oftentimes possible with comprehensive care. So recovery is really what we're after, and it is obtainable in most cases. I can't do anything for a person with a mental health problem. Well, really, friends and loved ones really can make a tremendous difference. Much of the time, they are the ones who make the referrals for treatment. And when we look at that, as I mentioned, most kids really don't receive treatment. So it's really the parents, friends, family, systems like this that make the referrals that get kids plugged in. So what can you do? It's, of course, reaching out and letting them know you're available to help, helping them with access to mental health services, sharing the facts about mental health, especially if you hear something that isn't true, combating the stigma. Most importantly, treating people with respect so they're willing to come forward. Of course, when people don't feel like they're being respected, they easily bury these behind different hidden curtains. And really refusing to define them by their diagnosis or using labels such as crazy or retarded or things of that nature, which we all can see as objectionable. So what are some myths for children with mental illness, just to review that a little bit more? A child with mental health disorder is damaged for life. Hopefully we see that's not the case. It's actually very hopeful, and that there are issues that we can really address and make better. Mental health problems result from personal weakness. Obviously not true. Psychiatric disorders result from bad parenting. Not psychiatric disorders. Of course, parenting can influence the manifestation of certain types of psychiatric disorders and the course they take. That's why when we do treatment, we want parents involved. They can be such a positive influence on really how kids recover. They are the most important person in a child's life to really help them guide them. That's why we, as therapists or people that provide care, want you involved. You're the major healing factor. It's not the doctor, it's not the therapist, it's really working on those things at home to really help someone progress. And even things such as medicine, they can be helpful, but they're oftentimes secondary. Therapy for children is a waste of time. That's more and more research shows how important therapy is really for helping kids with anxiety disorders, depression, mood problems. Children are over-medicated. This is a big one that I get. Are some children over-medicated? Yes. But the vast majority aren't getting the medication they need. And so when we look at different disorders, we can see at prevalence rates, certain things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Clearly, the outcomes for most children are better if they have medication with therapy. But the vast majority of kids with ADHD don't get medicated, don't get treatment. Of course, with anything, you always have to follow the basic, what are the evidence-based guidelines? And they can be managed appropriately if done so with appropriate mental health care. Okay. Now, next thing is just to talk about what are some common mental health problems in young people. Problems with following directions and being disruptive. Kids with oppositional defiant disorder. Attention and concentration, ADHD. That's about 8% of really grade school kids. depending on what series you look at. Problems with drugs and alcohol. Of course, this is an increasing problem. Opiates are not so much a problem in the childhood group, but oftentimes the behavior that leads people into more typical opiate use as they turn into young adults oftentimes is during adolescence. And so there's things we can hopefully do to really intervene to kind of stop that progression. Problems with worries or anxieties or anxiety issues. This is probably one of the most crippling issues that stays hidden. Kids who refuse school or kids who don't get involved in activities because they're worried about how they'll be perceived or will they be rejected. People think they're worried that they'll look stupid. And when you start hearing this, these are things that are pervasive in these young people's lives that oftentimes really prohibit them from fully engaging and really being happy and active in the things they can be. Problems with past experiences and trauma, young people that have experienced loss, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Problems with eating and body image, especially in adolescents and in young females. Loss and grief with many of the young people that have lost. It's interesting, I work here at Cincinnati Children's. We have one of the biggest psychiatric hospital programs really in the country. With about, if you go to College Hill, we have about 86 beds there. We help operate the inpatient unit and the partial program at the Lindner Center in partnership with them. So we have 102 beds. The vast majority, and they're usually full from about this date and time until May. They'll be full almost every day. And many of those kids, the majority oftentimes, are from families that have been fragmented, either through divorce or death. One of the effects I mentioned, the opioid abuse problem, is we're seeing the effects in children not so much from using opioids, but the effect it's had on their parents and the disruption in families. And so this issue of loss and grief, I think sometimes we don't fully realize when we see these effects on substance use on young adults or parents, really the cascading events that it has for others. Problems with mood and sadness, such as depression and bipolar disorder, and then, of course, suicide. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit. We're going to change gears a second here. Just talk about brains a little bit and the nervous system. Whoops, I'm going a little too fast. First thing is the nervous system's real complex. This is just a picture of really, the nervous system from the brain to some of the peripheral nerves. So if you ever get a question about what's the longest cell in your body, well, it's a nerve cell. And it goes probably from the back here all the way down to the tip of your toe. So it's 3 feet long in some people. That's a pretty big cell when you start thinking about it. So the nervous system is really diverse and the most complicated really organ system there is, and we have a long way to go to try to understand it. But we're going to try a little bit tonight. So the first thing is I want to talk to you just about what is a nerve cell. And so if you look at this on the left, and I'm not sure, does this have a pointer function? I'll probably blind myself. Oh, here, look at this. Okay. So here, this is the cell body, and then these are dendrites, and then this is what's called the axon. And so what happens is nerve cells connect with each other. The dendrites are kind of where the sensory information, or where they receive impulses, and the axon is where they transmit an impulse. So if this nerve gets stimulated out here, it kind of generates an electrical charge that flies down here, releases chemicals, which we'll talk about, then stimulates the next cell. So if we look at a simple reflex, everybody's probably had this happen to them in the doctor's office, I hope. You tap on the nerve, tap on the patellar tendon. It stretches your muscle just just a tiny, millimeter. But there's a little bundle of sensory right there that says your muscle's getting stretched. So it sends an impulse through this nerve right into your spinal cord that tells this nerve, make that muscle tense up. The reason it does it helps you from falling. Because if that muscle's getting longer, your leg's collapsing. So you want to stand up. So it helps you stay erect. Now that's a simplification, but that's what's happening. This all happens in microseconds. So we'll get to why that's important for us here in a second. So how do those nerves communicate? Those nerves communicate through what we call as a synapse. And the synapse is where, this is the end of the axon, so right here, we're looking at this little spot right here. And what happens is a nerve impulse goes flying down there, And if it's strong enough, it releases these little bags of chemicals into this little space. And those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. Why is that important? Okay, you've all heard about like dopamine. You've heard about probably norepinephrine, serotonin, right? These words that get kind of pitched around. Well, what are those? Those are neurotransmitters. Okay, and so many of our drugs that affect mental health and disorders are around this communication spot. So for instance, everyone's heard of Prozac, I would assume, right? How does Prozac work? Well, what Prozac does, there's this little pump here, neurotransmitter reuptake pump. So what happens is the nerve impulse comes down, it's strong enough, these little bags get released, they release a bunch of serotonin right there. If enough serotonin binds to those receptors, it triggers this nerve to fire the next step. So that's how things work. What Prozac does is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It basically slows that pump down. So what happens is more serotonin stays out there for a longer period of time. Now these are microseconds this is happening in. But that's the way it works. And after a period of time, it actually starts changing the receptor density and characterization in these other nerve cells. So that's how we oftentimes see medications work. We also see some disorders kind of focus on this. Like for instance, when we think about like schizophrenia and hallucinations, there's certain areas of the brain where there's too much dopamine activity, whether it's receptors or dopamine in the synaptic cleft, too active. So certain medicines that block dopamine receptors, like put a lid right there, oftentimes help with hallucinations or delusions. So what's important here is that there's a lot of also genes that control how these things work that probably are a little bit different in all of us. And when we start talking about things like trauma or experience, these are the things that change our behavior and what we experience and what we see. So in some ways, what happens to us psychologically or through experience gets translated biologically into how these nerves interface with each other. And hopefully we'll explain that a little bit better in a second, why that's important. Okay, oops. All right, so the next thing I just want to kind of what's I think really cool about the brain is that it's like a map. Now most people, we think of the heart, it kind of beats, and we think of different chambers. Well, the brain is kind of like, it's like a Google Maps in your head. It's like, okay, this point refers directly to that point, or this function refers directly to that spot in the brain. And another way to look at it is, if we get to these two areas of the brain called the, basically the sensory cortex and the, sensory cortex is the blue and the motor cortex in the red. If I touch that part of the brain right there, I'll make your tongue stick out. I mean, that's how it's directly mapped by these cells and how they function. If I would touch you right there, you'd feel like a little prick on your finger, if I touch that part of your brain. So the brain is very much kind of mapped very specifically to how things function. And so when we see disorders of certain parts of the brain, they oftentimes have very specific types of symptoms or problems. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to move ahead a little bit and talk a little bit. So we're trying to put a little bit of a puzzle together. We have biology, we have the brain, we have how nerve cells work. Now let's talk about kind of adolescence a little bit, kind of the impending storm, if you will. So challenges to young people that we see. 10 to 12% of our nation's youth suffer from serious mental illness that causes significant impairment. As we mentioned, half of the disorders start by the age of 14. We see a lot of depression episodes each year in children, about 8%. Only very few receive treatment. High rates of suicide, second leading cause of death. In the previous year, 17% of U.S. high school students seriously thought about killing themselves. Untreated mental illness is associated with many other problems associated with drug, alcohol abuse, violence, school failure, legal system, potential suicide. The other thing we see is this tremendous risk-taking behavior. Part of the reason this is happening is the brain is still developing. Many of the things that, the world is becoming more complicated, but the adolescent brain isn't caught up to speed yet. One way to kind of think about this is the brain develops maturity at different patterns. And the last area to mature, without going into too much detail about neuroanatomy, is the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex I like to kind of think of as it's like the brakes. Okay? It tells you to kind of stop doing something, or think about what you're doing, or pay attention to this. How do we know this? Well, people that have injuries to the prefrontal cortex, their attention's horrible. They can't really plan. They can't prioritize things. If you do things to impair the prefrontal cortex, like start drinking, okay, you are more impulsive. You're likely to say things you wouldn't say. Your learning is worse. Your memory isn't as good. You basically take the brakes off the brain. That's the last area of the brain to mature. One other way to look at it is the more purple it is, the more mature it is. So the brain kind of matures from the back to the front. This is all happening in your teenage students or your kids. Their brain's not mature. The brain doesn't fully mature really till well after age 25. So things are still kind of developing even in people that are in their early 20s. And it really kind of goes from back to front. And it's that frontal lobe which is the last part to mature. So when we think about brain health, you have how does the brain develop? We've talked a little bit about how the brain kind of works from its different functions in regards to nerve cells and location. But what are other things that can involve? We'll talk about genetics here in a second, health and wellness, family and social relationships, and social media. We'll kind of touch on a few of these things if we can briefly. So what are some things that we seem to really help? Well, diet does seem to help a lot of people with kind of mental wellness. Exercise increasingly is being seen as a treatment for depression. Its effect size is quite large, and so really that idea of becoming more healthy physically oftentimes helps emotionally. And then of course sleep, as we'll be talking about I think in the near future here, is very important in maintaining that. Some of the things that we see as causing real distress in young people is of course stress and the things that they pay attention to, perfectionism, and then of course negative experience. So this is actually a slide that I stole from Nancy, or she gave to me, was that basically looking at the idea of what does cell phones and things do. We really don't know the full effect, but there's some things to be a little bit frightened about. Okay, so what this slide shows is that on 2007 the iPhone was released, and the top upper on left-hand says not hanging out with friends. And so basically has different grades, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, and that really the number of the times teenagers are going out without their parents with friends plummets. Really social interaction decreased, not increased so much because of cell phones or associated with that. The next one is more likely to feel lonely. Again, people were not less lonely, but more so. And then less likely to get enough sleep is also escalating with, of course, the use of cell phones. There's even things now about intimacy and a more intensive look at relationships that show kind of the digitization, perhaps, has not facilitated kids really having genuine relationships. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about a little bit is, of course, family connections. Of course, the research in so many areas shows that good family support helps anything from compliance with diabetic care to major depressive disorder to relapse rates and schizophrenia, any way you look at it. That idea of having a supportive environment and an environment that's not critical really helps so many of these illnesses get better. And a lot of that's about warmth in relationships, acceptance, not being in a hypercritical environment. Those are the types of family qualities that really lead to healing and resilience. The next thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is adverse childhood experiences. This is kind of a hot topic in the community. You may hear about ACEs. And ACEs really refer to events that happen in your growing up, let me just skip ahead here, that affect later in life. So what are some of those experiences? Like growing up in a household with substance use problems, kids who have been in families with separation and divorce, living with a parent with primary mental illness. Really big problems are issues about violence in the home when a mother's been battered. and of course criminal behavior by an adult. Abuse, having psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all make sense. And then of course having emotional and physical neglect. So why are these important? Well, these are really determinants of later mental and physical health, and we'll show you that in a second. The more ACEs people get, the more they get problems with alcoholism, drug use, depression, but it goes beyond just the mental health problems. It actually extends into heart disease, cancer, lung illness, fractures. Some of these we can kind of explain by social interaction, but actually the more we're looking at it, things like obesity, we're beginning to actually see that it changes the way the DNA is basically transcribed. That basically, like for instance, the DNA in my hand is the same as the DNA in my brain in each cell. But they get expressed differently because of where they are. What we're finding out is experiences change how genes get expressed. And remember all those genes all that thing about the neurotransmitter. There's genes that affect every one of those. What we're beginning to learn is that by experience, we're beginning to now alter how those genes get expressed. Some of the interesting work about trauma is that it expresses some of the genes around kind of how we manage insulin. And so there's this implication with people that have trauma. They've seen studies like this, identical twins separated at birth. One grows up in a traumatic household, one does not. The twin who has the trauma is more likely to be overweight, more likely to have heart disease, more likely to die earlier, more likely to have depression, even though they have the exact same genetic code. And that's really what this term of epigenetics really refers to. The idea that there's genes, but then there's issues that influence how genes get expressed. And the whole purpose of kind of going through this is to try to get you to think about experience translates to biology. Experience and biology together oftentimes help determine the way we feel and think, respond, grow. So it's not one or the other. They are intermingled, experience and biology. And the thing is by altering experiences, hopefully we are able to change the biology back to a more healthy one. Okay. All right, just a little bit more about ACEs. As you can see, these are common. 4 or more is found in about 12% of people. And with only about 35% of people having 0 at all. So these are common experiences. So another way to look at it is as your ACE score increases, so does your risk of disease, social and emotional problems. With an ACE score of 4 or more, things start getting serious. The likelihood of chronic pulmonary lung disease increases almost 400%. Hepatitis, 240%. Depression, 460%. Attempted suicide, well over 1,000% higher. So these things have have oftentimes a very strong influence on what happens later on in someone's life. Okay. All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit more about signs and symptoms of depression, because this is one of the more common things I think parents become concerned about as they address their kids. So oftentimes when we talk about depression in young people, sometimes it's hard for them to tell you. There's the barriers about kind of conversation, and we always want to facilitate kind of an open relationship between parents and their kids. But sometimes it's hard to actually identify that you feel that way. Because depression is somewhat of an abstract concept. It's not something that I can kind of just put up and hold in my hand. What kids can tell you much more readily, though, is are they still having fun? Do they still enjoy life? Or do they still enjoy things? And when they start feeling like the enjoyment's kind of getting sucked away, that's oftentimes really the sign that depression really is set in. And so I think oftentimes as a parent, really kind of detecting, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit about joy in life in the next talk, is that really is so important. Is the everyday experience of a child, not that we don't want them to work hard and things like that, but is there some type of joy and that they have in their life that makes them feel like I'm connected to each day in a positive way? And when that kind of dissipates, I think is really when we as a parent or a teacher or an advocate really need to start thinking about things in a different way. So just kind of some of the symptoms: sad or anxious or empty mood, feelings of hopelessness or pessimism, irritability, guilt, worthlessness, helplessness, loss of interest and pleasure in hobbies and activities. Again, that loss of interest and enjoyment, I think, is key that I would want you to kind of take home with. Problems with energy or fatigue, and the more severe ones. We actually see some of the kids with depression, they don't talk as much. They don't move as much, or that it really gets slowed down. Problems with schoolwork. Oftentimes, as a clinician, when I hear about a kid struggling at school, one of the first things that goes, when I start hearing, well, when did it start? Well, if it starts when they're in 6th grade, I'm thinking ADHD. Okay, do they have an attentional problem, or do they have a reading problem, or some type of learning issue? When I hear about when they're 14, then I need to start thinking about this, because one of the most common things is struggles with really staying on task, problems with concentration, attention, staying involved. We also can see things that are more kind of physical manifestations, such as problems with sleeping or appetite, weight changes, and then, of course, thoughts about suicide. In younger children, we often see what's on the bottom line here, and that's more somatic symptoms. Stomach hurts, feel pain. And the thing is, those things begin interfering with their participation, and they withdraw. But a lot of times, again, because they can't necessarily put into words that I'm feeling depressed, and an adolescent may say, I'm not having fun, and a younger kid, it may feel, I feel sick. And so those are things that, again, that oftentimes we need to be aware of. Common presentations, I think we've kind of talked a little bit about this, somatic symptoms, so I won't get into that so much. But one thing I did want to comment was about perfectionism. And just very briefly is that higher perfectionism is associated with higher suicidal ideation 6 months post-discharge from hospital. This is one study that was looking at kids that had perfectionism and had suicidal ideation. Socially prescribed perfectionism, the perception that others require perfection of oneself, predicted concurrent levels of suicidal potential in an adolescent population. Perfectionistic youth less likely to seek help, and prevention efforts need to promote resilience, so that's what I think we'll be talking about soon. And I just want to make a comment here is this is really a tough thing to go after. The reason being is that oftentimes, some of the toughest depressions I've seen are from families who are some of the greatest parents who I admire because they do such a great job for their kid. Sometimes the kid internalizes it the wrong way. Instead of feeling, boy, it's great that I feel supported, mom and dad understand me really well, and it's fun to be around them, it's more of, you know what, there's these expectations they have of me because they're so good, and you know what, I'm failing, and I'm not making it, and they're going to be disappointed, and the last thing I want to do is disappoint my folks. And it's really, when you talk to the parents, they say there's nothing even close that those kind of expectations. Somehow we have to find ways of breaking through that barrier so that kids realize that they have the ability to succeed, but also to fail, to excel, but also just be okay. And that they can internalize that as part of who they are and not feel like they're driven to kind of stay at high levels of perfectionism. Oh, I forgot to advance that. So that's when, so you can understand if that kid has that perception, it's going to be harder for them to reach out for help because they're going to struggle with identifying with, okay, it's okay to reach out for help, and they don't want to look vulnerable even to their peers. So it's very important that we establish communication patterns to really help those children feel that they can be accepted when they're not excelling. Okay, just a couple of things I want to say about programs. One of the programs that we support is called ADAPT, or Steps to Last. And it's about, and we're going to get to identify a couple of programs here. And this is one where we just try to work with kids to identify themselves in a more easily fashion to ask for help. And then also, just as I think Hope Squads do, is to help kids identify themselves for help, or identify to other adults that someone needs help. And so these are, I think, these peer-to-peer groups are very, very helpful. And basically the idea of cutting down on the barriers to people escalating a concern. That idea of escalating concern, I mean, it's really quite fascinating when you look at even whether it's intensive care units or high nuclear plants, whatever it might be. When you see bad things happen, oftentimes behind the scenes is this resistance to kind of escalate a concern or the lack of a pathway. And so that's why I think it's so encouraging that places like here or other schools are really trying to focus on how do we get involved in those pathways of escalating concern to get kids the help they need. Now I'm going to skip through that. So, helping individuals with mental health problems. There is no hope for people with mental health problems. Once a friend or a family member develops mental health problems, he or she will never recover. And I think is the theme here is that that's not true. We can do a lot to really help kids. So a story real quick. Patrick is a 12-year-old. He tells his friends that he is sad, wanted to jump out of his window at home. Feels like no one likes him. He is having trouble in school. So he says sometimes he wishes he would not wake up. His friend lets his teacher know that there was a problem. The teacher talks with Patrick, and together they let his mom know. They get the treatment he needs, and now he's happy and doing well. This is actually an increasing story that we hear about, is that these types of programs really help kids get to the care they need. So one of the things, Nancy, who's up in the back too, with Susan, has really promoted 1 in 5. And this has been another, I think, really extremely positive intervention here across our community. And it really kind of, again, supports these efforts that really try to escalate concern, promote mental wellness in schools. The idea that we're trying to break down the barriers about escalating concerns, focus on decreasing those issues around perfectionism, bringing people together, to begin discussing programs together that we can share that have success. Really remarkable work. And this is just some of the work that she's done with us here at Cincinnati Children's. Oh, sorry, I'm advancing the wrong one. Thank you very much. I really fell behind. I guess I was caught up. So, prevention efforts is really a joint venture. All of us can really decrease stigma. We can all work to improving awareness. That's the step to last, adapting the surviving the teens, the work that 1 in 5 does. There's other work such as signs of suicide that are really educational pathways in identifying kids at risk. Mental Health America has done work about educating others. Peer support, bring change to mind. Nancy's been promoting that in many schools. We also have Hope Squads that have worked at an increasingly number of schools here in the region. And excellent programs. Screening, routine screening attempts that we're trying to do at different schools using PHQ-9 or other assessment instruments. Treatment availability, I mentioned that the school-based care and being advanced in those areas. How do we really enhance what we're doing with the community? There's been a lot of work about improving the relationship of the hospital back and forth with providers here in the community to try to make sure that we're really addressing the needs that happen as they come up more effectively. So we're really trying to integrate this system of care. And it's not just doctors, it's not just therapists, it's really all of us involved in kind of coordinating the care together. And I think what we've seen is when we're able to do that, we're able to catch a lot of these kids before bad things happen and promote healing. So I'll stop there with about 10 minutes to spare and take kind of any questions. Yes?
Really a great overview, particularly focusing on the biology and the way it can interact with the environment. And I'm going to take kind of a different take that I think will be a good supplement, and in combination, I think will provide a really good overview of this problem of mental health in young people today. Thank you for coming here today. I frankly don't think there's much of a more important issue that faces parents, kids these days than what I think is fair to term a mental health crisis in this country. I'm just a little bit more of introduction. I'm a pediatrician by training, but have been really involved in medical education my entire career, and then also am a parent to two young women, 22 and 25 years of age, who I got to kind of witness firsthand the challenges that people may face, young people face as they go through the world as it exists today in many communities across this country. Dr. Sorter focused more on biology, and I'm going to focus more on environment and how that plays out, and particularly in some studies that I've been working on in recent years. So I do have to say I work for this organization called the ACGME, which is the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. My focus is primarily on physician well-being, but when I joined them about 1.5 years ago, I said the only way I'll work for you guys is if you let me continue to work on adolescent and young adult mental health, in part because I said medical students are coming to us already injured and damaged, and that we can't just start by helping medical student mental health. We got to work upstream. Hopefully they would not have a problem with my views and opinions expressed in this talk, but they don't necessarily endorse them. It's a separate part of my work. I do also have 2 disclosures that I'm going to hold till later. I'm going to tell this presentation is going to be more of a story than a talk, and every good story needs some suspense. So I will keep you in suspense for now. So we're going to start in my world, as I said, which is medical education and mental health of medical students. And you may or may not know about this. I'm just going to throw a couple stats at you. It's pretty disastrous, right? So medical students, for those kids in the room who aspire to be physicians, you may think twice after some of these numbers. 27% of medical students suffer from depression. That's a big meta-analysis and very reliable data. To put that in perspective, it should be about 5 to 6% for that age population. So we're talking not a little rise in depression, we're talking rates 4, 5, 6 times what it should be. Anxiety, burnout is seen in more than half. And suicidal ideation and suicide seems to be a problem as well. Adolescent mental health, though, is deeply concerning too. And I think one of the things that I've gotten greatly concerned by is that not only is mental health a problem in adolescence, it seems to be getting worse. So one stat I saw recently is that 12.8% of teens had major depressive illness in the previous 12 months in 2016. That was up from 8.7% in 2005. So almost a 50% increase in this rate of depression, which one might argue already speaks against just biology being a part of this, right? Biology doesn't change in 10 years. It's the environment that's changing. So we'll come back to this. Biology, critically important, but in terms of the changes and the surge, I think, what I'm worried about terribly is the environment. What components of that environment are important is up to debate, but we'll talk more about that. So that's national data, but what worries me, though, is what I describe as kind of these microclimates that exist in certain communities. And a big question, I think, is the communities that I've studied, is this the kind of thing that's going on in this community, right? So I've done research now in 3 high school districts that looking at depression and anxiety in students there, and I'm going to show you results from a couple. So one is a public high school in the East Bay of San Francisco. We studied 2,000 students there with a survey using a depression scale and an anxiety scale that have been around each for about 20 to 30 years, very well validated. You can't diagnose depression or anxiety with a survey, but once you get up to moderate, or if you screen positive for moderate to severe symptoms, if you ended up seeing a psychologist or psychiatrist, you'd be very likely to be diagnosed with depression. And look at these numbers. I mean, this doesn't even include the mild, right? This is just moderate to severe symptoms of depression. 54% of kids in this high school had moderate to severe symptoms of depression. 80% with moderate to high levels of anxiety. Really stunning numbers. And the key here is to say, this is not just a problem in big cities like, on the coasts. We did a similar study, Catholic Girls' School in the Midwest. What we found there, 44% with moderate to severe symptoms of depression, and 84% with moderate to high levels of anxiety. I've looked in the literature, and I've not been able to find any population ever studied with worse mental health outcomes than this. And these are relatively privileged communities. These aren't, places with high ACE scores, right? Middle class, upper middle class, relatively affluent communities. Tremendously alarming. I mean, to see those kind of numbers. These make med school look great, right? And as a quick aside, I mean, one of the things I this is a little prelude to where I'm going with this that you may be seeing, is before I went out to the Bay Area to do this survey, I met with 15 medical students from the Bay Area who were at St. Louis University, and I wanted them to describe what the culture and school, et cetera, was like. And after about 15 minutes, I asked them a question. I said, well, so which was more demanding, more rigorous, more difficult, more stressful? High school or the first 2 years of medical school? And like no one skipped a beat. No one had to think. They all said high school. High school being harder than the first 2 years of medical school. Something is off there, right? And we'll return to what that looks like in a minute. What were the lives, right? We didn't ask just about the mental health. We asked, what do your lives look like? And this is what it looks like. And again, if there's students in the room or parents of kids, may be able to say, how much do the lives described here look like there? Homework, 32% reported 4 or more hours of homework a night. And over half, 63%, almost 2/3 reported 3 or more hours, right? And then if you look at extracurricular activities, this is just on weeknights, 22% reported 4 or more hours, almost half reported 3 or more hours. So you're talking about activities outside of school after the school day ends of a good 6 to 7 hours average. Average. There were people doing 8, 9, 10 hours, right? And so what's the consequence? What's the number one consequence of that? Is sleep. On weeknights, 51% reported getting 6 hours or less a night. 81% reported getting 7 hours or less a night. What is an adolescent supposed to get? American Academy of Pediatrics says, anybody know? 9 to 9.5 hours. That's a profound sleep deficit that is leaving kids, I want to make sure this is clear, cognitively and emotionally compromised. They're cognitively and emotionally compromised when they're getting that little sleep, right? How about drivers of stress, right? So we are all thinking, they're facing these incredible stresses. We asked them to rate different sources of stresses on a scale of 0, no stress at all, up to 4. There was a significant stress, really pretty extreme stress in their life. And I'll show you the list in a second, but I'm curious what you all thought were the sources, the biggest source of stress. We asked about school stress, we asked about social stress, we asked about social media, bullying, cyberbullying, stress in families, relationship issues, et cetera, et cetera. So anybody want to take a guess what rose to the top? Yeah. Pardon me? Fitting in, right? That's social. It's a tough time in adolescence. Can you find friends? Can you, right? Good thought. Any others people want to throw out? Yeah, social media, right? It's really interesting. There's a narrative out there, and it's too early to tell, right? That it's all the social stuff of adolescence that's a problem, right? It's the cyberbullying and, Instagram and things like that. I'll show you the list the students came up with. Number one, getting into a good college. That was the number one driver by far. And there was a sense, without question, that if they didn't get into the best college possible, their life would be forever compromised, right? Number two, time pressure. If you're getting 6 hours sleep a night, it's time pressure that is going to be problematic. Amount of homework, no surprise. Pressure from self. We asked them about pressure from parents, pressure from teachers, administration, coaches. By far, the biggest pressure was self-induced. Second closest was not pressure from parents. It was pressure not to disappoint your parents, right? It wasn't like overt messages that, we want you to do well. It was the values that people may share kind of implicitly. And then competition for grades. Those were the stressors. The stressors were school. It wasn't social, right? Social media was one of the lowest. Bullying, one of the lowest. Family stress is one of the lowest. For some kids, it was really important. But for the vast majority, the environmental stressors were the things that go on in this building, right? So this is the question, is there another way, right? If we're seeing, and I think the jury is out, my belief is a lot of people, understandably, are pointing to iPhones and social media. I think that social media may be a symptom more than a cause. That if you have so little time in your life to have a meaningful in-person interaction with another human being, you're going to do it through a screen. We crave that interaction, and we've crowded it out of our kids' lives, right? So is there another way? I think that the work I did at St. Louis University may provide a path. And that's what I want to see what you all think of this as well. Can this efforts that I really led at St. Louis University in a medical school translate into a high school environment? So St. Louis University student mental health, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this, which is, I got to St. Louis U at 2004. I was the associate dean for curriculum, so I was responsible. I wasn't the wellness person. I wasn't the student development, student wellness person. I was the curriculum person. And frankly, in my job, I wasn't supposed to worry about mental health. But I started reading about mental health, medical student mental health in the literature, medical education literature, and I started getting concerned that, wow, high rates of depression, anxiety, this was coming out in like 2007, 2008. But I looked at our students, I said, wow, inconceivable to me that a quarter or a third of them are depressed and more than half are anxious. They seem really happy with school. I've worked hard to make it a supportive, nurturing environment. I'm really nice to them. I'm compassionate. And they really seem happy, right? I knew there were individual students who struggled. But we did something really important, is we didn't assume that was the case, and we decided to measure it, right? And so this is what we found. Using that same scale that I showed you with adolescents, we looked at moderate severe symptoms of depression. At orientation, this was for 2 classes before we were able to start making changes where we were gathering data. 2 classes. Orientation, they look good. They look like what they should. 6% depression rate. I'm just going to say depression rather than moderate to severe symptoms of depression. MS1, at the end of their first year, they look like students at every other med school, right? 27% had moderate to severe symptoms of depression, and that rose by the end of the second year, right? How about anxiety? They started off school a little more anxious than the general population, probably, but it got much worse, much worse. And the only way I could look at these results, and I think this may make sense to you, was we were doing this to them, and I was ultimately responsible. And when I got these results, I said, this is not okay. I'm not going to be in charge of an enterprise that is harming students in this kind of way. So we have to change. And the model is an interesting one, right? Which is really simple, and I don't think is unique to medical education. I think it can be done in other educational settings as well, which is, this is an environmental health problem. I really believe that. There are certainly significant numbers of kids, of students, who have the biology that leads to depression, anxiety, etc., right? But I think that the environment is playing a profound role in producing the really high rates of depression and anxiety that certainly we were seeing in medical students, but also in high school students. So when you view it as an environmental health problem, then you need to attack it as an environmental health problem and work on those environmental issues. So we looked at the environment, where could we enhance it, and how could we kind of reduce unnecessary stressors? So that was number one. Second, though, and you alluded to this as well, Dr. Sorter, was this issue of perfectionism and how kids these days are making sense of the world and how they view performance. We thought that we could teach them some skills, basic resilience skills, that would help them deal with stress, not just of medical school, but of life going forward. And then this last one, I should add the word joy, right? Is I wanted to create opportunities for them to find meaning, also joy, and I'm going to change my slide to do that, right, in their life, and the idea that if they had that, it would be protective for their mental health, right? So those were the broad kind of model, very simple, and these are the interventions. And the idea is not that you do these interventions here, but I'm just going to illustrate the kinds of things we did. So first of all, we across the board cut in the curriculum by 10%. Every single course director had to cut their class time by 10% and reduce the amount that they were teaching. With that time, what we did was we created one full day every other week for elective activities and just time for themselves, right, where they just could do what they wanted. So every other Wednesday, elective activities, and those were managed by these kind of learning communities of making human connections with other people that I think that Dr. Sorter alluded to can be so sustaining, right? And then finally, we did pass-fail grading. It had been graded before that and moved to pass-fail grading. Not something I think that is likely to be accomplished here, but that's okay. Second was a resilience and mindfulness curriculum that used to be 6 hours in length. By the time I left, it was an hour and a half. A lot of these skills are not difficult to teach. And I think, bright kids can pick up on this, and if it's reinforced, I think it isn't just medical students who could benefit from these. Younger kids, I think, can as well. And my understanding is already at Mason in the school district, work is being done in that regard, which is great. Third year, we made changes to the human anatomy course, which I would describe as an extremely toxic course. It was incredibly difficult, huge amounts of information. The exams were way too hard. Many students were failing the exam. And I didn't have the power to do this, but the dean, my boss, I told them, you can't do this to our students anymore. It's doing undue harm. It's not, you got to change. And they did. And it really changed from an extremely toxic course to a moderately toxic course. But that was progress. I think this does hold relevance, and again, parents in the audience, I don't think there was a single year in high school, my two daughters going through high school, where there wasn't one teacher who did undue damage to my kids. The 2 hours of homework, and everybody else was playing by the rules, but with 7 courses, one person laying it on can cause amazing distress, right? The rest of the changes I'll flash up there, but I'm not going to go through them because it was really those first 3, I think, that were most important in terms of the influence. So that's what we did. And this is what the outcomes were, right? So those first 2 years is the group that we had before changes. 6 years later, after throwing all of this at them, the depression rate in our first-year students dropped to 4%, the rate they came in with. Second-year students at the end of the second year was 6%, and that was right before they went into study period for step 1 of the national boards, which is a high-stakes exam of epic proportion. It makes the ACT or SAT just seem like just a cakewalk, right? People are unbelievably stressed by that. So that was depression. Anxiety also dropped. You notice it drops in orientation. That was because our second-year students ran orientation. And they told the students, you don't have to worry that much. This is a great place to come, right? But look at the number for first-year students. Dropped to 14% from in the mid-50s, and second-year students, again, right before they went into this national exam, 32%. Actually, numbers I didn't think were possible. If you told me 6 years before that we would get to that kind of outcomes, I would have said, no, that can't be done in medical school. And one of the things I kind of like to say is you can arguably say that the first year medical students at the end of the first year, as a class, this was 3 years of this also, not just this class, they arguably had better mental health at the end of the first year than when they arrived. So that it can be said for the first time in medical education history that the first year of medical school was therapeutic for their mental health. It's wild, right? It's wild. So, external benchmarking, there's a survey done, a national survey by the Association of American Medical Colleges, and there's all sorts of things that showed we had a better environment. I'm not going to show you those numbers, but I am going to show you something interesting, which is SLU students reported getting half an hour more of sleep per night than the average medical student. About an hour and a half more per night than the average high school student studied. They were getting 7.5 hours a night, all right? But what they were also doing is spending an hour and a half less per day in class or studying. I mean, so we backed off, right, in a significant way, and the students embraced it. And what some of you may be thinking, though, is this big question, right? Our students studied hundreds of hours less than other students for the Step 1 exam. They slept hundreds of hours more than the average medical student. Academic performance has to suffer, right? Has to suffer. And that's the sweet part of the story. That Step 1 performance, that all-important Step 1 exam, no, over the years, the mean score actually rose, paralleling the national average, right, which was also rising, but the failure rate dropped in half. For 3 straight years, our failure rate was 2%, in which the national failure rate is 4 to 6%, and it shouldn't have been that low if you look at the test scores of the students coming in. We're not, Stanford. We're not Harvard. We don't admit the absolute cream of the crop academically. We can't, right? So we were outperforming things academically, right? Despite backing off. So this is where I get to the disclosures, and this is always I laugh, I don't know why. This is a slightly uncomfortable part. So we're sailing along, students doing great, academic performance. I should also say 97 to 98% satisfaction with our graduates. People loved our graduates, partly because they were great human beings too. They weren't just great, technical doctors. They were great human beings after they left our school. So we have accreditation visits every 8 years. 2008, we'd sailed through. They loved what we were doing. 2016, they came back for a visit. We had no worries at all. We knew we were out of compliance with a few things, but the site visit, as soon as they walked in, we knew we were in serious trouble because they hated us. And I still don't know why they hated us so much, but they hated us. And they hit us with like 18 citations, and we were at risk for probation, which is just devastating for a medical school. At the time, there were no schools on probation. It's usually 1 or 2 a year, right? So we wrote a letter back saying, hey, you hit us with all these citations. Half of them are factually incorrect. You say, we're not using outcomes to improve the curriculum. We're measuring outcomes no one else in the country is measuring. We're measuring mental health outcomes. We have evidence of change that is profound. They say, well, you aren't managing your curriculum. We'd made more changes in 8 years than the previous 50. I mean, it was a very surreal experience, but this is the piece that made things even more interesting, which is our old dean retired, a new dean comes in, and unbeknownst to me, receives a decision of probation, which you have the opportunity to appeal. And he hid the decision from me, didn't appeal, all right? We were placed on probation, the only medical school at the time, and then he fired me a month later. Yeah, I didn't see it coming either, right? Yeah. The good news, the probation was really painful, the getting fired wasn't, in part, because of the resilience skills I taught the students. They were very, very useful in that situation, which was great. Can I say, I haven't been able to say this part of the story, and this is being taped, but that's okay, I don't care, is the dean who fired me lasted about a year before he was fired. So he got his comeuppance. And I hold no bitterness. Bitterness is a lousy emotion, right? Out of it came the biggest professional gift of my life, that I'm paid to come out and visit places like yours. So, How could this happen? Not the part of me getting fired, right? How can you back off academically? And if there's any message, especially for parents, teachers, administration, I think this message is maybe the most powerful and important one, which is we have this, fundamental, I think it's a human belief, but with an American twist, that more is always better. Right? So if an hour of homework is good, imagine what our kids could accomplish with 2 hours. And if 2 hours is good, think of the outcomes if we had 4 hours of homework, and on and on. It turns out there is no human endeavor that follows that continuous upward path. Doesn't exist. I say that with confidence. Please tell me if you can think of one. But seriously, there is no human endeavor that as you increase things, that performance continues to improve. Instead, what it looks like is the following, and this is called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And on the horizontal axis, you have stress, but it could also be homework, class time, and on the vertical axis, you see performance, right? And what happens as you add stress, as you add homework, as you add class time, initially it's great for performance. It rises. But there is a certain point where it actually plateaus, and then performance actually starts to drop. And what I would say characterizes medical education and increasingly characterizes high school education, as we all are racing for test scores and getting into the best college possible and elite status when you get your report cards tomorrow, right, or whatever it is about your school. Everybody's chasing these numbers and status, and it's coming at a cost, right? And it's not just coming at a cost of mental health. This is the key, is I think we are way too far on the right-hand side of the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and the reason performance improved is by counterintuitively, by backing off, you actually move up the curve. You move up the curve. So if anybody wants to debate with me, like, oh no, you can't cut back. That's lowering standards. That's lowering expectations. Our kids won't achieve. No, prove that to me. I don't think it's the case. I think there's profound evidence that if you back off in high pressure environments that exist not just here, but in communities all over the country, not only will mental health improve, I think the actual performance of our kids will improve. Don't forget, they're cognitively compromised. What does depression do for learning? You said one of the signs is you can't concentrate, you can't focus, So if you have a sleep-deprived, depressed kid, they're not working at their potential. We're impairing them in this pursuit that we want them to excel at. It makes no sense whatsoever. So what can we do? Right? I wouldn't be here if I didn't think there was something we could do, right? I think this is fixable in some ways, or at least not fixable. We're never going to eliminate depression. We're never going to prevent all cases of anxiety. But the surge that we're seeing, I think we can cause to turn around. And I think the key is this. I love this photo, which is, the canary in the coal mine. They used to bring the canary into the mine, and if the bird got sick or died, they knew they had a problem. What they didn't do, they didn't teach the canary to meditate. They didn't buy him yoga mats. They didn't say, watch out for the other sick canaries, which we need to be doing. All of the work that's being done in these schools and by groups like Mind Peace and mental health providers is so important. I don't mean to criticize that. It is vitally important. But it's not going to solve this problem. We need to start recognizing the problems in the minds. And one of the things that I think is so important, it's one of the few areas in these kids' lives that we actually have some control over. I can't manage their parents. I can't solve poverty overnight, right? I can't change their biology. I can't even get them to probably, manage their cell phone usage better. But what we can do is change the educational environment, and it's not just the amount of school, it's the culture that surrounds it. And one of the things I've got to say is a lot of times people are like, oh, it's the teachers, it's administration, and then the teacher's going, oh, it's the parents, et cetera. There's all this finger pointing. No, there's a collective ownership of this problem that we have to have, and that only if we work together as a community, I think, are you going to see any changes in this regard? So where do you start? To me, I think it's go back to the drivers. What do the kids identify as the stressors? Wonderful place to start. So number one, getting into a good college. I mean, I think there has to be a public health campaign to disabuse people of the idea that going to the elite college is by definition going to put you on a better path to success. It's false, and there's profound evidence to show that getting into the Ivy Leagues, unless you want to be, if you want to be an investment banker, that's, yeah, okay? But otherwise, you look at Fortune 500, senators, leaders in the community. They didn't all go to Ivy Leagues, right? So there's this mythical idea that the most elite college is best, and there's profound evidence that it's not the case. Time pressure, amount of homework, that's in our control. And it's not just a homework issue, extracurriculars. I mean, if you have programs here where it's like you have some really enthusiastic coach or drama person, et cetera, who's keeping their, my daughters went through this drama stuff where it was like 5-hour practices for 7 days before the exam, before the performance. That's not okay if it's coming at the expense of our kids' mental health, in my book. And it is. I mean, that's where I think it is. Even if the kids love it, even if kids enjoy it, too much of a good thing is a problem as well, right? Amount of homework, pressure from self. This gets into this perfectionism stuff that I think there are simple resilience skills that everybody needs to learn. There are basically cognitive behavioral techniques that if you are developing an anxiety disorder or depression or panic attacks, and you see a therapist, most commonly they're going to use cognitive behavioral techniques. My feeling is, well, why do we withhold them until you've developed mental health disorder? This is great skills to help you make sense of the world and to stop beating up on yourself. I mean, the treatment for maladaptive perfectionism is cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, let's insert that early and reinforce it. And frankly, it's not just kids who need it. Parents need it. Teachers need it. Administration needs it as well. The problematic mindsets, Dr. Sorter kind of alluded to these with perfectionism, and there's some relatives that I have to just mention, right? I'm not sure why those got inset, but there's nothing there. So comparison, right? It isn't that your performance, you can't be happy with your performance, it's just only as it compares to others. So only if you're better than a bunch of people are you okay with it, right? That's endemic. Performance as identity, not I got this B+, I am this B+. It's who I am. It's how I am valued as a human being. Perfectionism and self-blame. If I'm not doing well, it's all my fault. I'm stupid. I'll never make it. I'm not worth anything. Maladaptive perfectionism. And then these feelings of inadequacy, embarrassment, and shame. We actually did a study of medical students, and if medical students screened positive for maladaptive perfectionism, there's a scale actually that measures it. That I always, whenever I say that, I have to then give the name of the scale because it's my favorite name scale. It's called the Almost Perfect Scale Revised. Don't you love that? They revised? I think that's just priceless. Yeah, they almost got it right the first time. But if you have maladaptive perfectionism, you're much more likely to have feelings of embarrassment or inadequacy or shame about your academic performance. And if you have inadequacy, embarrassment, or shame, you're much more likely to be depressed or anxious. So these mindsets can, I think, be powerful drivers of distress that when layered onto a biologic susceptibility, I think is a recipe for disaster. And it isn't a character problem. It's not a flaw. It's not a weakness. But these mindsets are being nurtured and fostered in this kind of relentless, measuring, ranking, sorting that we're doing to our kids as they go through school. So the path forward is pretty simple. One, this is my personal belief, and I think was incredibly important at St. Louis U, was measure the students' mental health and look at what are the sources of stressor. I don't know what your community looks like. I don't know if the rates are anything like the ones that I described before. But if you don't have that information, I think you're flying blind. And you can throw a lot of things at this problem and really don't know if they work or not. In the medical education world, oh my gosh, people are throwing all sorts of things, more on the side of yoga and meditation, et cetera. But if you don't measuring it, you can pat yourself on the back and say, oh, we're doing a wonderful job. But I think your confidence in your efficacy is really limited. And we can talk, if you want, at the end about, you can do this in very non-intrusive kind of ways that cost virtually nothing and can be done anonymously, protect people, et cetera. We have to challenge this myth that the best college is, the elite college is the best college. That seems to be driving a lot of this behavior in kids that I'm seeing. I think we need to have strict limits on how much homework is assigned, and it needs to be monitored, and we need to work with people who aren't following the rules. I was talking earlier with somebody, like you're not supposed to hit a kid in school, right? We have rules against that. But we allow people to have educational practices that I think are highly correlated with adverse mental health outcomes. In my book, that should not be okay. That should not be okay. Need to find a different way of teaching than pushing kids so hard that their mental health is suffering. And it's not just homework, it's extracurricular activities. We already talked about this. The cognitive skills to combat toxic mindsets and distortions, I think, are incredibly important. And then this last one, maybe this is the trickiest one. I think if you do the other four, then these other things open up. But creating more opportunities for students to find joy and meaning in their lives. And I know there's some things already going on here at Mason that's freeing up some slots for students to do that with and create connections with other. And I really applaud you. I mean, one thing I didn't make clear, I think, right at the start, I've visited a number of schools across the country, and one of the things I'm struck by already, you guys are doing good things here, right? But man, you have to amp it up further, right? It is a wonderful start. More than I think almost maybe any school district I've seen, there seems like a willingness to make change here that I think is incredibly admirable. And I think pushing that further, though, I think is going to be important. Right? We can do things around prevention that are really focused on the individual, but what we also have to do, right? So mental health awareness, reducing stigma, making sure people get the care they want, helping people with perfectionism. But what we also have to do is push really aggressively, in my book, on the environmental drivers that we have such control over, right? I'm saying the community, not just the administration, not just the teachers, but this whole community, I hope has the will to push. Because I tell you, this is desperately needed. This is desperately needed in this country. And my sad story is that those two schools that I talked about, virtually no action based on those, which I find unbelievable in some way, and I still don't understand. If we are, involved in activities that are harming our kids this much, I think there's a moral imperative for us to take action. So I urge you all to be powerful voices for change and partners in it. School can't fix this. John can't fix this. Teachers can't fix this. This is a whole community. And what I want to make clear, by making those changes, I don't think you're going to be compromising your kids' futures in any way. You're going to be enhancing them. Because the biggest threat to your kids' success is not the academic achievement that they accomplish here. It's the mental health that they, bring forward as they go to college, right? That's what you also want to make sure they have before they leave the nest, before they're off on their own, that in a supportive, nurturing environment, that you can set them on that trajectory, not just for academic success, but for success and happiness and mental health in their lives. With that, I will close, and I wish you all the best and hope you great success and happiness in this endeavor. So I will stop there. Thanks so much. Thank you. We still have time, and John, I don't know, do you want to come up? Dr. Sorter, please join me as well, or you can step up if questions arise. What I'd love to hear, I mean, of course, is questions, but I want, like, from parents, like, does this resonate? And especially if they're skeptics, right? If you're like, I don't know, I'm not sure I buy this. Please let me know. So anybody want to, or John, do you want to, anything you want to say, or should we just open it up? No, you come up and tell me how, yeah, you're the master of ceremonies. I want to be, yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I do want to thank everyone for tuning in and being here. We do, because this is community conversation, we'll have our experts around, but we also have some question prompts out in the commons out here. We would like to invite you to come out because you heard a lot of information here. We would love you to have a chance to meet someone new. That's something always we love to do at our community conversation. So meet someone, say hi to someone you don't know, and then engage in a little bit of conversation before you head out. And if you have, and we can take questions here for a few minutes before we do that. So just so you know, before you take off, we will have some questions out there for you to engage in.
Yeah, so anybody, please. Yeah.